Alright, so at this point I've reviewed Silent Hill 2 Remake using the PS5 copy, and then I brought it again on Steam and explored it a little bit more in the recent pickups video. The short story is it's a wonderful game and a GOTY candidate for me. But if you're playing it on the Steam Deck, it's more than a little rough, which makes perfect sense. The Steam Deck is powerful for what it is, but the loss of thermodynamics keep it from getting PS5 or true dedicated desktop gaming rig performance. But that being said, I thought I could probably dive a little deeper into the game and see if we could get a better baseline of how it performs further into the story, and maybe even eke out some additional performance with either improved visuals or a slightly higher frame rate. So that's what today's video is all about. Not a massive Digital Foundry style deep dive, just a closer look at my experience in testing a few different graphic settings to see if I could make the journey into Silent Hill a little bit smoother. Also, full disclosure, this is kind of new territory on the channel since I don't normally do these types of videos, but if it proves useful and people like it, then maybe I'll consider making it a staple of the channel. But for now, let's dive into the process by first looking at why the initial performance and foray into Silent Hill was likely so choppy. Out of the box, using the game's default graphic settings, the performance was pretty lackluster with a frame rate that was in the 20s at best and the teens at worst, which plants it firmly into unplayable territory for most people. But I also think that initial rockiness probably needs some additional context. The opening portion of Silent Hill 2 Remake, where James begins his journey outside of the rest stop, is iconic and truly jaw-dropping artistically and technically here in the remake. But that beauty comes at a significant resource cost. You've got long sight lines, tons of assets loaded in, trees and brush swaying in the wind, and that's to say nothing of Silent Hill's iconic fog thickly blanketing the surrounding area. Or more to the point, Silent Hill 2 Remake is a beefy boy. But having already beaten the game, I know that only this initial portion has this same level of detail. The rest of the game doesn't have massive outdoor nature-based areas, but rather is mostly limited to spooky interior environments, which tend to serve as Silent Hill 2's dungeons of sorts. After entering the first main area, Woodside Apartments, you're only outdoors every now and then, and when you are, it's mostly limited to being inside the town of Silent Hill itself, where, ironically, the fog masks those long sightlines. And while I'm guessing the fog is computationally expensive to render, the trade-off might be that, much like the PS2 original, it also helps to obscure the environmental details in the distance, which might be more expensive from a performance standpoint. Granted, interiors might pose their own challenges to stable performance, what with the dynamic lighting from James's flashlight, roaming enemies, environmental particle effects, and fluid rendering for when we find those areas that are quite literally dripping with atmosphere. So here's my approach to get a more nuanced idea of Silent Hill 2's performance on the Steam Deck. First, I wanted to make it to the Woodside Apartments, procure James's flashlight at the very least since that's a pretty persistent part of the Silent Hill 2 experience, and then after that, I'll sample the apartments for a while to see how the deck holds up to the unique challenges of its interior environments, and then go over my findings. And along the way, I'll test tweaking the settings and break down any tips or takeaways from my experience. I mean, provided I don't get too spooked, of course, because this game is pretty terrifying after all. Plus, it does give me an excuse to play more Silent Hill 2, which I'm pretty much always down to do. So first, let's take a look at the journey to the apartments and see if it holds up well with the settings that I originally modified to get the game running more smoothly, and just to recap, those would be as shown. I'm keeping the resolution at 1280 by 720, enabling FSR 1.0 and setting it to favor performance, and finally capping the frame rate at 30 FPS. And we'll be maintaining these settings until we get to the point where we're just about to make our way to Woodside Apartments. So where I left off from the prior video's captures, I had just gotten into the town itself. In the opening portion, you're sort of eased into a vertical slice of gameplay, whereby James is presented with a puzzle that requires collecting 3 pieces. And since I've already played through this portion at least 5 times at this point, I knew what to expect, and it was a great way to check the baseline settings to see how Silent 2 holds up after you've left the comparatively more taxing wooded walk into town and start exploring the town proper. Making the journey back and forth between Neely's Bar and a few other key locations within about a 2-block perimeter gave me a chance to get a feel for the performance when traversing the town proper, and the results were about what I expected and even a little better. Initially, I thought the town's fog might occasionally cause major hits to the frame rate, but it was actually the opposite. These portions generally remain smooth, though you'd see a slight hiccup when nearing any buildings you could enter, likely due to the game loading in assets, prepping for you to start exploring the interior. To that end, actually entering buildings with greater threats like groovy music still performed well with a frame rate that stuck at near constant 30 FPS, even when I was being attacked by a couple of lying figures. And I figured these enemies in particular would cause issues with performance, specifically because of that gross bile projectile attack that they have. My prediction was that rendering these fluids and the subsequent screen obscuring effect that occurs when you take damage from these nasties would cause a more severe dip. But nope, it actually all stayed pretty steady, which was a nice surprise. And that seemed to be true of the other buildings I explored while working towards the key that would unlock the Woodside Apartments. And this is the portion that I was most concerned about. Just before you start working your way to the apartments, there's a sequence where the wind kicks up ferociously, the fog thickens, and a veritable army of lying figures surround you on all sides. This is sort of Silent Hill 2's way of ushering you towards the first dungeon over at Woodside. And with all this going on, I figured this would be an excellent spot to experiment with tweaking the settings. So I went ahead and made this literal test run to the Woodside apartments 4 separate times, with various graphics options tweaked to see what resulted in the best experience. And with your comments in mind, huge shout out to Young Ball for the inspiration, I set out to see if we could push Silent Hill 2 closer to that sweet spot of 40 FPS, which is kind of the holy grail for the deck when it comes to more demanding titles, since it's just close enough to mimic a smooth 60 FPS experience. Here I tried out an FSR 1.0 setting of balanced rather than performance, with the frame rate uncapped. My hope was that this would reduce the strain a bit during a fairly chaotic sequence while also improving the visuals. Did it work? Well, sort of. Just standing still, it initially looked really promising, with the frame rate rocketing up close to 60 FPS. But my hopes of keeping it anywhere close to that were pretty quickly dashed once I got in motion on the first run. Even though it mostly kept up at 30 FPS and would occasionally spike up into the 40s during James's mad dash to the apartments, it was pretty inconsistent. I also tried a slight variation on these settings by enabling half-rate shading with a TDP limit set to 8 watts, but this run seemed to perform worse, unfortunately. On another reload, and the 4th attempt that I tried to make this run, I tried to dig into some of the more advanced quality settings to see if I could get a bit more nuanced about it, ideally maintaining some of the fancier visuals, but paring them back a bit by disabling motion blur and SSAO, dropping the shadows, and stripping adjusted resolution scalability back to 100%. Which essentially means the GPU doesn't have to work as hard. Unfortunately, even with these tweaks, the results remain dicey at best, where there were brief sense of smoothness, but also massive dips into the mid-20s at times, so yeah, not the best. Ultimately, I ended up settling somewhere between the initial baseline and what I found on the second attempt of the run, returning to the balanced FSR preset with an unlimited frame rate at 1280 by 720 resolution. But now that we've spent some time beating the route to the apartments to death, now let's look what happens when you actually make it inside Woodside Apartments, and in turn, the new horrors within. And I was especially curious about how a large interior environment would play out once I'd gotten the flashlight. With this extra light source bobbing around on James's person, I figured we'd see even worse performance. And in fact, I did see worse performance, just not in the way I expected. After getting the flashlight and getting summarily jump scared again by a mannequin, I was pleased to see that the whole sequence played out really smoothly, hanging well above 40 FPS and in fact very close to 60 FPS most of the time with these settings. And that remained true as I explored other portions of the apartments. Anytime you have James in tight, confined spaces, the frame rate is demonstrably better. And considering that's mostly what you'd find in Woodside, it was very encouraging. However, I did hit a couple of snags that I did not expect, but upon closer inspection, this made total sense. The first was in the western stairwell, which leads you to the second floor and makes up the bulk of your exploration in this area. I was surprised to see that the frame rate dropped dramatically on the stairwell, and at first I wasn't sure why. I mean, it's a stairwell, and super dark at that when you first arrive prior to getting the flashlight. But later on, as I went through again, I immediately spotted the issue. The stairwell had windows, which isn't in and of itself a problem, but these weren't just static textures, rather they were true windows, meaning the exterior was plainly visible and in turn still being rendered. Fog, weather effects, roaming horrors, and all. Meaning that in addition to the interior with its lighting and James's flashlight, the game would also have to keep rendering all the exterior features as well. So long story short, it's a gorgeous choice environmentally speaking, but a taxing one for the Steam Deck's comparatively meager hardware. Thankfully as a liminal space you won't be hanging out there very much, so it's a little jarring when you first get in, but it also represents only a small percentage of the time you'd spend in Woodside. The other area that caused some drops was really just an extension of what I'd learned from the stairwell, and that would be the courtyard near the lobby. This too combined interior and exterior elements, since you not only spend time directly outside with its shift and lighting, but this too is a liminal space of sorts since you don't spend a ton of time in this area, but rather use it as a go-between for larger sections of the apartments. You can kind of see this here as I'm performing a light platforming puzzle to re-enter the building, and sure enough, as soon as I do, you see a dip before it stabilizes when James enters the more confined areas. So in a nutshell, if you want the most consistent experience using the basic options, I had the best success with the 30 FPS cap, 1280 by 720 resolution, and setting FSR 1.0's preset to performance. However, if you want to try and push the frame rate and visuals a little bit harder, then I'd recommend uncapping the frame rate and setting the FSR 1.0 preset to balanced, which, again, it's definitely going to be inconsistent, but for the majority of the game where you're creeping through tight, confined spaces, it'll definitely be smoother in most cases, just not all. Also, a quick note on battery life for portable mode. I was expecting that given the technical prowess of the visuals that it would just roast the Steam Deck's battery life in probably under an hour. but I was pleasantly surprised to get closer to 2 hours using the FSR balance preset with the higher frame rate settings. So while you won't be doing any marathon sessions, a beefy backup battery like the Anker I recommend in the description can definitely extend that time significantly. In the end, Silent Hill 2 certainly is a challenge for the Steam Deck to run, but ultimately one that it's mostly up to. If you don't mind capping at 30 FPS, you'll get a more even experience, but if you want to push it even higher, just be ready for dips in liminal spaces and the admittedly few sections in the game that have more taxing weather effects beyond the standard fog. Sadly, I wasn't able to achieve a consistent frame rate above 40, which is really what I was after here, but hey, live and learn, right? And this experiment was hardly a wash since I got to better familiarize myself with the settings on a deeper level. But hey, if you're more of a graphics tweaking wizard and have any advice or feedback, I'm sure the community would appreciate the insights, and selfishly speaking, I definitely would appreciate the insights because I just can't get enough of this game. And while this specific version of Silent Hill 2 may be pretty unforgiving on the deck, here's hoping a combination of new patches from Bloober and experimentation from the community will have us find that sweet spot for performance. You know, our special place. Alright, and that's it for this one. Again, not an incredibly deep dive or anything like that. I'm not exactly Digital Foundry over here, but I did want to start experimenting with the format of doing, just a deeper performance look at games and how they play on the Steam Deck here and there. As for what's coming up on the channel, I will be doing a cozy games list here in a couple of weeks as the holidays close in, and with 2024 coming to its end, I'm also putting together a video on regular maintenance that I do on the Steam Deck periodically, since the new year is for new beginnings. And believe me when I say that I am very excited for the channel in 2025, thanks to a lot of new enhancements and refinements I'm testing out on the back end, so stay tuned for more, and if you enjoyed this video, well, you know where to find me. As always, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to hang out here with me on the channel. Have a tremendous day, and I'll see you on the next one.